All hail the Queen!
Long live the Queen!
Cleopatra was black. After watching this video, you'll never question it again. Let's go straight into it. For nearly 3,000 years, Egypt stood as the greatest civilization on the African continent. Pyramids that touched the sky, temples carved into mountains, gods worshipped in gold and stone. And at the very end of that long, unbroken chain of pharaohs, one woman stood as the final ruler of it all. Not a footnote, not a side character, the last pharaoh. Her name was Cleopatra, and she ruled Egypt with a mind sharper than any general's sword and a will stronger than any army Rome could send against her. She took the throne at 18 years old. Think about that for a second. 18. An age where most people today are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives. Cleopatra was already sitting on the throne of Egypt, a kingdom that had outlasted empires, survived invasions, and stood as a beacon of wealth and wisdom for millennia. She didn't inherit a quiet, peaceful kingdom either. She inherited chaos. Egypt was drowning in debt. The Nile, the very lifeblood of the nation, had failed to flood properly, which meant crops failed, which meant hunger spread through the land. Her own siblings wanted her dead so they could rule alone. And looming over all of it was Rome, the largest and most terrifying military power the world had ever seen, watching Egypt like a hawk circling a wounded animal. Most rulers in that position would have crumbled. Cleopatra didn't crumble. She adapted. She calculated. She became one of the most brilliant political minds in the history of the ancient world. Here's something most people never learn about her. Cleopatra was fluent in at least 7 to 9 languages: Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, Median, Parthian, and more. She was said to be the very first ruler in her entire dynasty, a dynasty that had governed Egypt for nearly 300 years, who actually bothered to learn the native Egyptian language. Every ruler before her relied on translators to speak with her own people. Cleopatra refused to be one of them. She walked among her people, spoke their language, participated in their religious ceremonies, and presented herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. This wasn't a performance for show. This was strategy. This was a queen who understood that real power doesn't come from a crown alone. It comes from connection. It comes from being seen by your people as one of them, not a distant ruler hiding behind palace walls. Now let's talk about what she actually did with that power, because this is where her story becomes legendary. When Cleopatra's brother and co-ruler tried to push her out of power and strip her of the throne, she didn't run and hide. She didn't beg for mercy. She built an army. She raised forces in the eastern regions and marched them toward the Egyptian border, ready to fight for what was hers. At the same time, one of the most powerful men in the entire world was making his way into Egypt. Julius Caesar, the general who had already conquered Gaul and shaken the foundations of the Roman Republic itself, arrived in Alexandria chasing his rival. Cleopatra saw an opportunity most people would have missed entirely. She needed to get into the palace to speak with Caesar directly, but her brother's forces controlled the city and would have killed her on sight. So what did she do? According to the accounts passed down through history, she had herself smuggled into the palace, hidden and carried past the guards so she could appear before Caesar unannounced and unexpected. Picture that moment. A young queen, barely into her 20s, walking into a room to face the most powerful military commander on the planet with nothing but her intelligence, her presence, and her nerve as weapons. No army behind her in that room, no soldiers at her back, just her mind against his. And it worked. Caesar was captivated, not just by her presence, but by her intellect. She spoke with him about philosophy, about governance, about the history of Egypt stretching back thousands of years, about mathematics and astronomy. This was a woman who had been educated at the Library of Alexandria, the greatest center of learning the ancient world had ever known, a place that housed the collected knowledge of Africa, Greece, the Middle East, and beyond. She didn't just look good, and honestly, historical accounts suggest her true power was never really about physical beauty at all. It was her voice, her wit, her ability to command a room with words alone. Ancient writers described her voice as an instrument, capable of shifting from language to language, tone to tone, charming and commanding in the same breath. Caesar backed her claim to the throne. With Roman military support behind her, Cleopatra defeated her brother's forces and secured her place as ruler of Egypt. But here's what makes her different from every other monarch who ever needed foreign help to secure a throne. She didn't become a puppet. She didn't hand Egypt over to Rome in exchange for the favor. She used the alliance to strengthen her own position while keeping Egypt's independence intact. She played the game of empires better than anyone expected a young African queen to play it. Under her rule, Egypt experienced something incredible. While Rome was tearing itself apart with civil wars and political assassinations, Egypt under Cleopatra remained one of the wealthiest, most stable, and most sophisticated kingdoms in the entire Mediterranean world. She reformed the economy. She devalued and restructured the currency to deal with inflation. She improved trade relations stretching from the Horn of Africa down through regions we now call Somalia and Ethiopia, all the way to India in the east. Egyptian ships under her rule carried goods through the Red Sea, bringing back spices, incense, ivory, and exotic treasures that made Alexandria one of the richest trading ports on earth. She also took direct control of Egypt's grain production during a famine, something previous rulers had left to officials and administrators. Cleopatra personally oversaw the distribution of food to her people during one of the worst droughts in the kingdom's recent history. She issued decrees in her own name reducing taxes on farmers so they could survive the crisis. This is a ruler who understood that an empire is not just armies and gold. An empire is people, and if the people starve, the empire falls with them. Let's talk about her military campaigns, because Cleopatra was not just a diplomat sitting on a throne. She commanded ships. She led naval forces. She personally financed and organized war fleets. When conflict arose between Rome's warring factions after Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra had to make dangerous choices about who to support, knowing that choosing wrong could mean the end of Egypt as an independent kingdom. She aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of the most powerful Roman generals of the age, and together they built a combined military force that controlled territories stretching from Egypt through parts of what we now call Libya, Syria, Cyprus, and regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Under this alliance, Cleopatra's influence expanded far beyond Egypt's traditional borders. She was granted control of Cyprus, parts of Crete, sections of the Levant including areas of modern-day Lebanon and Syria, and territories in Cilicia. Egypt, under her rule, became the center of a vast sphere of influence that hadn't been seen since the height of the pharaohs centuries earlier. She minted coins with her own image on them, something almost unheard of for a female ruler at that time, declaring herself not just queen, but a ruler equal to any king in history. On these coins, she didn't soften her image to appear more traditionally feminine or delicate. She had herself depicted with a strong, commanding presence, a ruler who wanted to be taken seriously as a political and military force, not just admired. When war broke out between Antony and Octavian, the man who would later become Emperor Augustus of Rome, Cleopatra didn't sit back in her palace waiting for news of the war. She personally led a fleet of Egyptian warships to join Antony's forces at the Battle of Actium. 60 ships under her direct command, loaded with treasure to fund the war effort, sailed into one of the most consequential naval battles in ancient history. The battle didn't go their way. Rome's forces under Octavian proved too strong, and the combined fleet was forced to retreat. But even in retreat, Cleopatra's decision-making showed the mind of a strategist. She pulled her forces back to Egypt rather than throwing away her remaining resources in a battle already lost, preserving what she could to continue the fight on her own terms. When Octavian's forces finally closed in on Alexandria itself, Cleopatra refused to be taken as a prisoner to be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, a humiliation reserved for conquered enemies. Even in her final moments, she controlled the narrative of her own story. She chose how her reign would end, on her own terms, in her own kingdom, refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of dragging her through Rome as a trophy of conquest. Now here's something truly remarkable that gets overlooked far too often. Cleopatra's reign wasn't just about war and politics. She was a scholar in her own right. Ancient writers credited her with authoring texts on medicine, cosmetics, and even weights and measures. She took a genuine interest in science and engineering, surrounding herself with philosophers, doctors, and mathematicians from across the known world. Alexandria, under her rule, remained the intellectual capital of civilization, home to the great library that housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the collected knowledge of Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. She didn't just inherit this legacy of learning, she actively participated in it, engaging with scholars and supporting the continued growth of Alexandria as a center of science and philosophy. She also understood the power of image and presentation in a way that feels almost modern. She staged elaborate meetings designed to leave lasting impressions on foreign dignitaries and rulers. When she first met Mark Antony, she arrived on a barge with purple sails, silver oars, and attendants dressed as mythological figures, transforming a political meeting into a spectacle that Roman writers couldn't stop describing for generations afterwards.
This wasn't vanity. This was propaganda, theater, and diplomacy woven together into a single powerful statement. Egypt is wealthy. Egypt is powerful, and its queen commands respect. Think about the sheer weight of what she carried. She ruled during an era when women holding independent political power was almost unheard of anywhere in the ancient world. Rome itself, for all its military might, did not allow women to hold political office or command armies. Yet here was Cleopatra, ruling a kingdom independently, commanding fleets, negotiating directly with the most powerful men in the world as an equal, not as a wife or a consort standing in someone's shadow, but as a sovereign ruler making decisions in her own name for her own kingdom. Her reign lasted around 21 years, an incredibly long time for any ruler in the ancient world, let alone one who inherited a kingdom in crisis and spent decades navigating threats from rival family members, foreign invasion, and the shifting chaos of Roman politics. 21 years of holding Egypt together. 21 years of keeping her kingdom independent while empires around her rose and collapsed. 21 years of proving again and again that she was not a ruler to be underestimated. When her reign finally ended, it marked the end of something enormous. Not just her life, but the entire era of Pharaonic Egypt itself. 3,000 years of pharaohs, stretching back to the earliest dynasties, to the builders of the pyramids, to the rulers who shaped the foundations of civilization itself, came to a close with her. After her death, Egypt became a province of Rome, and no Egyptian ruler would ever again sit on that throne with the independence and authority that Cleopatra once held. She wasn't just a queen. She was the final guardian of an entire civilization's sovereignty, and she held that line for over 2 decades against pressure that would have broken most rulers, male or female, within years. Her legacy stretched far beyond her own lifetime. Roman writers, even those who opposed her and painted her as a dangerous seductress to justify Rome's conquest of Egypt, could not deny her intelligence, her political skill, and the genuine fear she inspired in Rome's leadership. They wrote about how Octavian himself feared her influence so deeply that after her death, he had her image removed from public monuments in Rome, terrified that even her memory could inspire resistance against his rule. Think about that. A dead queen and the most powerful man in Rome was still afraid of her. Egyptian culture, art, and religious traditions she supported and protected throughout her reign continued to influence the ancient world long after Rome absorbed Egypt into its empire. Her image, her story, and her reputation as one of the most formidable rulers in history have survived for over 2,000 years, discussed, debated, and admired across cultures and continents. Very few rulers in human history, man or woman, from any civilization on Earth can claim that kind of lasting impact. Cleopatra stood at the head of Egypt, an African kingdom with roots stretching back thousands of years before her birth, and she carried that weight with a strength that echoes through history to this very day. She wasn't handed an easy path. She built her power through intelligence, strategy, courage, and an unshakable determination to protect her kingdom's independence for as long as humanly possible. She negotiated with generals, she commanded fleets, she fed her people through famine, she spoke 9 languages fluently in a world where most rulers couldn't speak the language of their own subjects. She supported scholars and scientists. She staged diplomacy as theater and turned meetings into legend. And when the end came, she chose it on her own terms, refusing to let Rome write the final chapter of her story for her. That is the real story of Cleopatra, not a myth, not a rumor. A queen who ruled Egypt, an African civilization thousands of years old, with a brilliance and a boldness that history has never forgotten and never will. Let's slow down for a moment, because there's more to her story that deserves to be told properly. Details that get skipped over far too often in the rush to talk about her romances instead of her reign. Start with the city she ruled from. Alexandria was not just the capital of Egypt, it was, by most accounts from the ancient world, the greatest city on earth at that time. Built on the Mediterranean coast, it had 2 massive harbors filled with ships from every corner of the known world. It had wide, planned streets, something rare for ancient cities, most of which grew in chaotic, twisting patterns over centuries. Alexandria was designed with intention, with grand boulevards running in straight lines from one end of the city to the other. Towering above the harbor stood the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the tallest man-made structures on the entire planet at that time, a beacon of fire visible to ships from miles out at sea, guiding sailors safely into port. This was the city Cleopatra called home. This was the seat of her power. And within that city stood the Great Library, a place that held the single largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world. Scrolls on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, and history from Africa, Greece, Persia, and beyond, all gathered under one roof. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by this. She was educated by scholars who had access to the accumulated wisdom of civilizations stretching back thousands of years. This is critical to understanding who she was as a ruler. She wasn't just trained in politics and diplomacy. She was trained in science, in medicine, in the study of the stars, in mathematics. Ancient sources credit her with writing on cosmetics and pharmacology, meaning she took a genuine hands-on interest in chemistry and the medicinal properties of plants and minerals, knowledge that was considered advanced even by the standards of her time. Now think about her coronation and how she chose to present herself to her people. When Cleopatra took part in religious ceremonies, she didn't appear as a foreign monarch imposing herself on Egyptian tradition. She appeared dressed in the traditional garments associated with the goddess Isis, one of the most powerful and beloved deities in the Egyptian pantheon, a goddess associated with motherhood, protection, magic, and the very throne of Egypt itself. By presenting herself this way, Cleopatra was making a direct statement to her people. I am not separate from you. I am connected to the gods you worship, the traditions you hold sacred, the land you call home. This kind of image building was deeply intentional. It tied her rule directly to thousands of years of Egyptian religious tradition, giving her legitimacy that went far beyond simple bloodline inheritance. Her economic policies deserve far more attention than they usually get, too. When Cleopatra took the throne, the Egyptian economy was struggling under massive debt inherited from previous rulers who had borrowed heavily from Rome to secure military support for their own claims to power. Cleopatra worked methodically to stabilize the currency, adjusting the silver content in Egyptian coins to deal with inflation while keeping trade flowing steadily through Alexandria's ports. She expanded trade routes reaching down through the Red Sea, connecting Egypt to the Horn of Africa and further to India, bringing back goods that made Alexandria one of the wealthiest trading hubs in the entire ancient world. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk, ivory, exotic animals, precious stones, all of it flowed through Egyptian ports under her administration, generating wealth that funded her armies, her building projects, and her diplomatic efforts. She also took a hands-on approach to agricultural crisis management that very few rulers of her era bothered with. During one of the worst famines in the region's recent history, when the Nile failed to flood at the levels needed to sustain healthy crops, Cleopatra issued a royal decree taking direct personal control over grain distribution. She didn't leave this to bureaucrats and administrators working several layers removed from the actual crisis. She involved herself directly, ensuring that Egyptian citizens, not just the wealthy elite, received the grain they needed to survive. She reduced tax burdens on farmers struggling through the drought, understanding that squeezing desperate people for revenue during a famine would only deepen unrest and suffering.
This is the mark of a ruler who saw her kingdom as more than a source of personal wealth and power. She saw it as a responsibility.
She engaged with science and scholarship at the highest level of her era. And when the end finally came, she chose it on her own terms. That is the real story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a ruler whose brilliance, boldness, and sheer force of will secured her place as one of the most remarkable monarchs in the history of the ancient world.